the majority of people don't get to pick when they retire. Having a plan, even if you think you're going to work for, another 20, 30 years, just gives you like that insurance.
Welcome to Retire Today. I'm your host, Jeremy Keil, and we're here to help you create your dream retirement. Today, we're talking with Anthony Napolitano about his dream retirement, his true retirement story. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on, talking about your true retirement story, what life is like. You're about 15 months into retirement, and I'd love to share some more true retirement stories. So if you're interested in sharing your story about your retirement, just email me, podcast@keilfp.com. Love to have you on the show and help others learn about retirement. So I mentioned, Anthony, you've been retired for 15 months. How's it going?
Oh, it's going great. Yeah, the journey to get here was somewhat planned, somewhat unplanned, but really enjoying what I'm doing now.
Yeah, and you mentioned some planned, some unplanned. You were telling me earlier that you've been kind of careful with money before while you're working, but you didn't really have a plan until maybe about 8 years or so before retirement. What changed for you right then?
Yeah, so I've always been a personal finance kind of nerd, hobbyist. I studied it in school, both undergrad and grad. But during my working years, I just saved money, but didn't really have, a plan per se. And then I was at dinner with a colleague, and he said, "Well, do you have a plan?" And I said, "Yeah, I just save as much as I can." He said, "No, do you actually have a retirement plan, and where your income's going to come from, etc." And I did not. He had an advisor and a planner that I ended up, working with, which was fine for some things and not so fine for other things, which we can get into if you'd like. But the planning part was great. And so I was 47 years old. I had for the first time in my life, an actual plan, up until I was 95, sources of income, et cetera. And as you go through that process, as you know, they ask you, well, what are your goals? What do you, want to achieve? And I didn't really have one other than saying, well, maybe I'll retire early. Let's retire at 55, which at that point was 8 years till retirement. And so that was my plan. That was, the goal and the plan that we put, forth. And then some things got in the way, if you will. Ended up retiring earlier at 52, which, we could talk a little bit about, what that journey looked like.
Yeah, it's interesting. A couple things real quick right there. You planned for 55, retired at 52. All the studies I show is that on average, somebody retires about 3 years earlier than they had planned. So you fit the mold, which would make sense. That's kind of the average out there. So you fit the mold on that. And I imagine having a plan, even though it said 55 and you hit that earlier, probably made it feel a little bit more comfortable, perhaps for you to say, okay, well, I'm 52, but I guess this is retirement.
100%. I'd worked at one company for 25 years. And then I got caught up in a downsizing there. I then worked on my own consulting, for a year. And it took a year to find another role, a senior executive, role. And then I found another one, and I guess I was age 50 at that point. And that time off and that having to look for another role, et cetera, really, I guess, steeled my nerves and had me get real serious about, my plan. And during that same time, I started walking every day, which I still do, about an hour and a half, 2 hours every day, and listening to podcasts. And that's where I kind of really rekindled my love of, personal finance. And so every day for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, I'm listening to personal finance podcasts, which is how I also found you. But having that plan really gave me a ton of confidence. So when I say I got retired, the second time, around again, another corporate restructuring, having that plan was huge. And also during that, 2 year period, I started thinking about the non-financial, elements of my, retirement. I know you've talked about, with Mike, a couple of weeks ago, the financial part is necessary. Obviously it's super important, having a plan, knowing that you can retire and what your income's going to look like and your asset allocation, all that's like super important. But about a year before I actually retired, I started focusing a lot more on the non-financial parts, how I was going to spend my time. And so that became a real focus, of mine. And again, when the time came for, me to hang up, the cleats, so to speak, um, of course it was a transition and I'm still in kind of that journey, but I felt a lot more prepared.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. And you're mentioning Mike Drak. We had the podcast. He wrote the book Retirement Heaven or Hell, and you had reached out because that really connected with you. What part of his podcast or his story really just like pulled you in?
I mean, yeah, I just, like I said, I listen to podcasts, just about every day, and the ones where I find myself nodding the whole time and like talking to myself about right on, just kind of really drew me in. One, his story about his working career. He worked in finance, and he was like, he never really gave him purpose. And then I think, if I remember, he also, came to an abrupt end,
Hmm.
with his company, and so like his own story really resonated with me because I was relatively successful in my career. I made it to a pretty senior level in some pretty big companies, but it never really gave me purpose. It was never something. Yes, I could say what I did, and yes, I achieved objectives, but I never really felt like I was contributing anything meaningful, to society, let's say. And so kind of his story really, resonated. And then the discussion about just the transition, into retirement and, how he dealt with, some, depression and things like that. And I'd actually heard, stories like that. I know you had Fritz Gilbert on your podcast several years ago. He's one of my quote financial heroes. And he talks a lot about, the non-financial, side of it. And so, just everything just resonated, with me. And so that's why I reached out.
Yeah, and with Mike Drak, his Retirement Heaven or Hell book, a lot of it is you think going into retirement it's going to be all roses. It's a heavenly experience, and then it maybe is for a little bit, but after the honeymoon's over, the highs can quickly turn into lows. It seems like maybe you didn't have the deeper lows that Mike mentioned, and good for him for sharing what could be out
Yep.
there. And I think a lot of it has to do. I was going to mention Fritz Gilbert. You beat me to it because you said that you were thinking of the non-financial parts of retirement a year ahead of time. And Fritz said himself, he was a retirement blogger before he retired, talked to all these retirees. They said, as soon as you hit retirement, you're going to stop caring about the money. You'll only care about the non-financial. And he thought, you're crazy. I'm the financial things that basically the only thing that matters. And as soon as he hit retirement, he started caring about the non-financial and not as much the financial. So you beat the curve there. You are ahead of time, perhaps because you were doing all the studying and listening to people like
Yeah,
Fritz.
big time. And I didn't believe it either. And again, I'm not going to say that I don't, think about money, etc. But I've always been like I said, a hobbyist. So I do follow markets. I do study it, but more just for interest. I never do anything with it. I'm a passive investor. I'm very vanilla, very, very boring, kind of financial plan. I do think about safe withdrawal rates and stuff like that. But really a lot of my focus has been on, how do I do things that, I find, meaningful. And I think, and maybe especially for men, maybe not, I don't know. I can only speak for myself. They're just kind of uncomfortable kind of discussions to have, right? Because it's really introspective, and it's really about like, well, what do I like to do, what gives me purpose, etc. And when you're working, it's easy because you just have the built-in excuse, well, I work,
Hmm.
right? And so what really got me, and again, I can't place where I heard it, but someone said, well, what you do on Saturdays is kind of a glimpse into what you're going to do during retirement.
Hmm.
And that really stuck with me because I mean, once my kids are grown, we're free birds, my wife and I, they're doing their thing. Once that was, they were gone. I mean, I didn't like what I was doing on Saturdays because I wasn't doing
Hmm.
much, but I had the excuse, right? Like, oh, I'm tired, and so, I'd worked all week, and it was just kind of, what you did. And so when I started getting real serious about retirement, that's why I started putting my focus on kind of those elements because, I knew if I was lucky enough to retire early, I'm going to have 20, 30, plus years of me trying to figure this, out. And so that's why I put a ton of emphasis on kind of those non-financial, elements.
Yeah. Well, that's good wisdom to look at not just the money, but the beyond the money part of it. Although you did look at the money part with the financial advisor. I'm curious if you're willing to share. And we're not going to ask to name names or
Sure.
anything, but I'm curious. What did you like about that financial advisor? Maybe what drew you away
Yeah.
to be more of a do-it-yourself type of investor? I think that'd
Yeah,
be helpful to hear.
for
Kind of
sure.
what you found, what you didn't like, and maybe what you
Yep.
would want in an advisor. That might be helpful for others to hear that.
Yeah, that sounds great. Like I said, I had a very base understanding of just personal finances because of my education, right? I mean, undergrad was finance. I went to business school, finance. I didn't work in finance, but I had enough kind of base understanding. Never had an advisor. We just did the basics. We lived below our means. We saved money. We invested the rest. We avoided debt, like all the basic JL Collins, Boglehead, type of stuff. We got to this advisor through a colleague, like I mentioned, and what I really enjoyed was the plan. I'm a pretty structured fellow. My friends like to say it's not type A, it's type Anthony, and so I liked having that plan. So like knowing year in year out, how much I had to save, what my portfolio balance was going to be when I was 92, where income sources were going to come. I planned, my daughter's wedding and paying for that, and how often I loved that part. That was great. Um, the part I didn't like was more the I guess the investment side of it. And so there were things that were complicated that I didn't understand, that we did. They were also salespeople, insurance salespeople. So we got into some insurance, products that didn't really, fit with kind of what I thought was right. And then it coincided with me getting on these walks and getting really educated about the financial sides of it, and kind of that active investors don't do better than passive investors, and all that kind of came to a head. And so then I decided to go on my own. And
Yeah.
so again, the planning part, awesome. I think it's really important as you work with advisors that the investing part kind of fits your philosophy. And to have a philosophy, which I don't think I did going into, the initial kind of conversations. Once I developed my own, style of what I wanted to do, it just didn't mesh with kind of
Hmm.
what they were providing. And so it was time to kind of go on my own.
Yeah. It didn't seem like no hard feelings. It's just
Nope.
the way it was, and it was a good kickstart for you. I like what
Big
you said
time.
right there. Is make sure the investing part of the financial advisor relationship fits your philosophy, because I find that happens somewhat often, where you might think that okay, the job of the advisor is to beat the market, pick stocks and bonds, and do call options and different things that are maybe more than the plain vanilla, like you had talked
That's
about,
right.
and maybe the advisor isn't into that, and you want to make sure that you're finding the advisor that does those things that you want, or the opposite, you want the plain vanilla, and they are into all the esoteric, fancier parts of investing. So
That's right.
that's a good question to ask. I think is if you're looking for a financial advisor, say what's your investing philosophy, and maybe a
Yep.
good question to ask yourself is what is my financial investing philosophy.
I
So
couldn't
good
even answer
advice.
that question,
Yeah.
several years ago. Right. So I think it's fair, right? It's like you
Hmm.
have to have an idea, or even if you don't want to, maybe you just don't want to think about it.
Hmm.
Right. Maybe, I mean, I'm a nerd. I like talking about this stuff. I'm
Yeah.
into the markets. A lot of people aren't. Right. It doesn't mean you have to be complicated, though. I think
Right.
that's the
Yeah.
piece that, people need to have a little base understanding, as they enter these type of discussions.
Right. Well, you had a plan, and then you were let go. You said you took a year to find another role. What made you decide then to say, "I'm not ready to retire. I want to keep looking for a job, keep working"?
Yeah, it's a good question. It happened pretty abruptly, and so I thought, well, I got to go find another job.
Yeah,
Right.
'cause you have to, right?
I mean, I just was. I didn't. I had the plan. My plan said that I, needed to, work a few more years. Like I said, till 55. And so I thought, okay, well, let me get back in it. And it took a long time.
Hmm.
Um, and so, like I mentioned earlier, that really it was eye opening for me. That hey, maybe the skills that I thought I had, maybe aren't as relevant as I think. Or, just the higher you move up, the more challenge, there's just less spots. And so, that really kicked me in the tail, if you will, to get serious about, my plan. And then lo and behold, I get another role. And then 2 years later, um, I got retired. And, I'm really thankful that happened. Well, for a couple of reasons. One, I knew I was ready, and I had even
Hmm.
said during my time there, that this was the last job I was going to have. So,
Hmm.
yes, the ending came, quickly, but I was ready, to go. But I was grateful that they made the decision for me.
Yeah, I suppose
I don't,
sometimes it's easier.
big time. I don't know that I would have
Yeah,
had the courage to, pull the plug. I would have. My revised date would have been my birthday this year. So I
sure.
thought on my birthday this year, would I have done it? And I don't know. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. You hear about one more year, syndrome and all of that, and inertia just kind of takes over. And so I really am grateful that the way it happened wasn't my decision. And again, that I had a plan.
Yeah. Well, having a plan made it work out well, and worked out well that you're ready when it happened 3 years ahead of time. I found too is that when you do have that plan, it's easier to go into the office. You know that
True.
if I get cut today, I'm doing all right. Did you feel like you had a sense of I'm doing all right before you got the news you're being let go, or was it really
Financially, yes.
afterwards?
And I think
Okay.
the
Yep.
irony too, the irony too, a little side story on that. The day I knew that there were, some changes going on, at the company, and at the time we had our house up for sale, so we had a home where we raised our kids, and then a home in the mountains, which is where we settled permanently. And that house was on the market, and we actually closed that day that I got
Oh my
laid
goodness.
off.
Yeah.
So it actually, I mean, it was so fortuitous. I remember being on the call, and it happened, and I went into the kitchen where my wife was, and I said, I think I just retired. And so, yeah, leading up to that, and so it was like this feeling of, I can't believe that this is actually happening. But again, I was in a fortunate spot. I had a plan, and that that's really, I keep coming back to that. I just think anyone that listens to this, I mean, that would be one of my strongest pieces of advice. Even if you don't think you're gonna retire anytime soon, and I know people that say, "Hey, I'm never gonna retire." And we could talk a little bit about what some of those conversations are like. Like we talked about, the majority of people don't get to pick when they retire. That's factual. There's data to support. Either you get sick, someone in your family gets sick, or the company decides for you. So to your point, yes, having a plan, even if you think you're going to work for another 20, 30 years, just gives you like that insurance of, like you said, I was confident that when that happened, I didn't need to go look for another role, and I could focus on kind of what I want to do with the rest of my life.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of what you want to do with the rest of your life, you were telling me that you built something you call your retirement life plan, and every part of it, I don't think has anything to do with the finances. This is probably
Oh, no.
your way of working through what the non-financial side was. So tell us a bit about the retirement life plan, maybe how you came
Yeah.
up with it, and how you're making use of it now.
Sure. Yeah. So again, it's very structured, and I said, my friends call it Type Anthony. So I don't know that this works for me, right?
Yep.
And so I don't know that it would work for everyone, but I'm a pretty structured person. As I said, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and preparing for retirement, and then Mike, and his book. And so I didn't want to create a bucket list per se, because I just felt like too generic. And so, in listening to various and reading various, from various folks, I created these four pillars of this plan, if you will. One of them is around health. One of them is around kind of mindset, which is more like hobbies. One is around purpose, and then one is around relationships. So in each of those four areas, I have things that are established. So I try to make sure that I'm keeping my life in some sort of balance. So things that have become like habitual in each of those pillars. So like I've mentioned a few times, I walk every day. I lift a couple times a week. So on the health side, I make sure that I'm staying, active in both cardio and, weight training. The hobby, the mindset, that was the area I had to do the most work in because I never had a lot of hobbies
Hmm.
when I was working. So I was never a big golfer and all. I didn't have any of those. So I spent a lot of time creating a long list of those sort of things, and they're constantly in process. So, like for me, we're trying to hike. There's 6 peaks in San Diego. We're going to hike those. I study personal finance. I'm into baking and cooking, so I bake focaccia bread. We travel. We go to shows. I have a Jeep. We go off roading. I'm growing a vegetable garden, which is shockingly fun when something actually grows. So in the hobbies, that's kind of stuff that I'm continually working on. The purpose part, um, was something that was I thought a lot about, and so it was somewhat natural once I honed in on what I really enjoyed doing. So I'm a big sports guy. I grew up playing sports. I played sports in college. My kids, were competitive in sports and dance. So I love sports. I also love helping kids, and so something natural that came up was coaching. So I coach at the local high school. I'm an assistant volleyball coach there. I have a blog that gives me, purpose, which we can talk a little bit about. I'm creating a financial literacy program at the local high school. Again, combining things that I really enjoy, like personal finance, and then helping kids. So in the purpose area, I have those sort of things, and then relationships. Um, because I am totally structured, I have what I call a friends project. So every week on my calendar on Tuesday at 1 o'clock, I have a repeating calendar invite to myself to reach out to friends. So I either call them, text them. These are friends that either I've lost in touch with to kind of rekindle, or friends that I just haven't talked to in a while. And so, each of those 4 areas, I have things that, let's say, are established, things that are in progress that I'm like working on. And then I have a laundry list of things that I want to get to. And then I kill things that I try and that was just not for me. And so I just kill it. And so I have this kind of constant, it's a spreadsheet that I'm constantly updating and working on as things come to mind. I stick them in, kind of one of those, pillars on the spreadsheet. And then twice a year, when I go through my rebalancing exercise, etc., I rate myself on how I'm doing, in those areas, um, just because again I'm obviously kind of an achiever type, and so it just feels natural for me to kind of hold myself accountable. I am working on trying to be a little bit more serendipitous, and that's something I'm working on. But I wanted to err on the caution of being more structured, being more intentional in these areas, and then back off when I found myself in kind of an overcommitted state, which we can talk about, as well, versus the other way of just kind of floating around, and that would just feel unsettled, for me.
Hmm.
So this is how I kind of approach, you know, continually improving, continually working on things, trying new things out.
Yeah. Well, I like you're doing what works for you. It's great to see you still got a little bit of the corporate in you where you're giving yourself a 360 review twice a year,
Exactly.
and that's okay. Um, but especially I
It's
love
definitely
the
structured.
yeah, well, of all that, the Friends project to yourself, it's a reminder, right? Everyone says like, "Oh, I lost touch. I wish I did." Well, just put it on your calendar, and you're putting it on your calendar, um, and
Yeah,
that is all the studies show that men especially lose relationships. We're just not as good as it to begin with. But then just a bit of mortality is as we grow older, there's more of our guy friends that are dying
that's right.
sooner than the females, and it's tougher for the guys to keep in touch and tougher to start a relationship. So
Big
you're
time.
putting that
Big
you're
time.
making that happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's and I've always been kind of the one that's coordinating activities like that. That's always kind of been my role. I've just have done that. What's great to see is after some time, who reaches out to you. that maybe,
Right. Yeah.
because you're starting, you kind of get the ball rolling,
Hmm.
and they're like, hey, and then they just reach out and, just, whatever, just stuff. It doesn't have to be nothing serious, et cetera, or whatever. Or someone gives me a call, they haven't heard from a while. So I really am, it's something that I'm committed. Once you start doing it, it kind of has a life of its own. Because, people are receptive, right? I mean, they're like, great, thanks for reaching out. And some of the conversations now that, like, people that know that I retired early, it's
Hmm.
really interesting. Some of those conversations of people who are curious about that, those are really interesting conversations. Because they're curious and they want to know, like, well, what do you think about this? Or, how did you think about that? And those are really engaging. But unfortunately, it's, because of my age, it's a very small group that
Sure. Yep.
are even thinking about, that.
Hmm. Well, that's great. And you've got that's a bit of purpose going into the relationship, where I'm sure you're feeling a bit of purpose of like, hey, I help somebody out because I am sharing my experience about early retirement with them. That's great. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the financial literacy program that, I talked about, I'm just starting that out, putting together a curriculum, on that. And there's quite a bit out there already. There's nothing
Hmm.
like super structured, yet, because I think a lot of schools are just starting that. But I'm really hopeful that that will stick, because it's something I'm super passionate about. It combines two things that I'm passionate about. And I think, if I can pull it off and do it in a way that's effective for the kids, will be really meaningful, for them as well.
Yeah. Well, that's great to hear. Well, you've been retired 15 months. I'm curious, what was your biggest surprise and what's the best part of retirement so far?
Yeah. So I wrote a blog. I mentioned that I wrote a blog about what I learned in the first year, of retirement. So some are probably pretty, what people have heard before. So the whole, like, challenge of telling people you're retired is just, I didn't expect it.
Hmm.
Right. For me, I'd been planning it, but I hadn't really talked to anybody about it, other than
Hmm.
obviously my wife, knew what we were on the same page on that. So just that, obviously, in the US, that's like the second or third question, what do you do? And,
Hmm.
whatnot, I'm retired. And the responses are just so, like, just odd.
Yeah.
And a lot of them some of them are even just downright like, well, what do you do all day?
Right. Yep.
Like, it's just this disbelief of, that. And, people say, oh, I would never retire. I would just be too bored, so that
Hmm.
whole, so I started saying I coach, because
There
I
you go.
coach. I'm
Yeah.
trying to say something,
Interesting.
that, but even that, people were like, well, okay, but what did you do before? So it's just like
Right.
this odd, like, and so, like I mentioned, like, the people that are, what's cool is when you get the conversations where people are, like, truly interested and, like, wow, like, how did you do that? And just really curious and try to apply it, to their own situation. Those are really cool. But that was that kind of, I just wasn't ready for that, of that whole piece of it. And even to this day, I'm kind of over it, but still is never kind of an easy conversation. The other thing that um, kind of threw me was, as I was mentioning, I had this plan, and the two things that I wanted to do, like, top of the list on purpose, was coach and work at a winery. I just always, we have wineries where we live, and I was like, I always wanted to do this. And within 6 weeks, I did it. So I started working at a winery on Sundays. I started being the assistant volleyball coach, and then that turned into being the head basketball coach, because some of the they didn't have a coach. It's a very small high school, only 100 kids. So, if kids want to play, you need a coach, sort of thing. And I just found myself over the holidays just feeling, I don't know, just off. And so I just told my wife, is that I think I'm overcommitted. Like, I think even the stuff I really wanted to do, I just, the fact that, I was on a schedule and I didn't have freedom of, because I had to go to practice or do games, or on Sundays I had to do whatever, really was kind of getting to me. And so I really, after basketball was over in February, I'd said, I need to say no more. I need to get uncommitted, to get to a point where I want to go, I'm drawn back to do those things. And so that's really worked. Again, like, since February, I've been uncommitted. I just started working in the winery, like, last weekend, because somebody was sick. I went back. Awesome. It was super fun. Like, it was what I remembered. I'm going to do volleyball, again, in the fall. I'm not doing basketball. I've already told them I'm not doing that. So kind of finding that balance of, enough structure, enough commitment to do the things. It just surprised me, Jeremy, that even doing things that I I've always wanted to do, that I actually love doing and still enjoy doing, the fact of being overcommitted to
Hmm.
them really threw me off.
Yeah.
Just really, really threw me off. So those were things that, I kind of learned, in my first year.
Yeah, it's sometimes harder to say no when you're a volunteer. It's hopefully maybe more freeing to say, wait a second, I don't have to do this. I do
Right.
this. I'm voluntarily doing this. I can voluntarily not do it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I've never been good at saying no, especially when the kids, like they want to play
Yeah.
basketball. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
fine, I'll do it.
Yeah.
Sort of a thing. But finding kind of that line and balance has been really good. And again, I don't want to come across like I've quote unquote figured it out, right? 15 months in, and that's also something I think I keep telling myself, and anyone else that's kind of in the same place, is that it's a journey. It's not like a project that I'm gonna like complete, right? It's a process. It's a journey. It's going to constantly evolve, and change, over time. I think, I'm fine. I've adjusted from year one to, what I didn't like, and things I did like to do. But, if we talk 2 or 3 years from now, I bet I'm doing something different, than I'm doing now. And that's actually kind of the point, of, this kind of journey. And even when I feel unsettled, about whatever, like that time where I was just feeling like, either I'm not doing enough or I'm doing too much, I just tell myself two things. Like, I always come back to these two things. Not one day has passed, that I've ever wished I was still working. Not one. So I know you have people that come on and people that I'm going back to work because I'm bored, etc. It just shows me that never was the purpose of my life. And, so I tell myself, like, my worst day today is better than my best day, when I was at work. So, if I feel unsettled, I'm like, okay, I just got to figure it out. But like, the easy thing is like, I'm gonna go back to work, right? That's the easy thing. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, especially when people tell me like, oh, I would, I don't know what I would do. I'm never going to retire, etc. Like, this kind of introspective journey of, purpose and all those sort of things. Unless you're unfortunate enough, where the day you retired, the next day, unfortunately, you left the planet. You're going to go through this journey, right? I mean, whether you retire at 52 like me, 62, 72, whatever that is, you're going to work on these things. And so I just feel grateful that I'm able to do this, at an age where, I'm healthy, and, you know, I can explore, right? And I can go through this trial, and error. And I think those are the things I keep coming back to, which are kind of challenging for me, because I'm always like, I got to figure this out. I have a project, I got to get it done. And I'm like, wait a minute, like, this is maybe a 40-year project.
Yeah.
And so it's really about the process and kind of the journey, that's personal to you,
Yeah.
right?
Well, it took you
Sort of
30
a thing.
years to be a great worker, and now you're 15 months into being the retiree.
Exactly.
Yep.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so that's why, like, for me, having this plan that we've talked about, and kind of a framework and a methodology to, continually be kind of updating, things that I'm trying out, or things I want to go do, or places we want to go travel. Of course, I've got a travel list. Of course, I've got, those sort of things. Um, Works for me, because it shows that I feel like, okay, I'm making quote unquote progress, whatever that means. And I feel like, okay, I'm doing things that are meaningful, to me. And like we're talking about, like, creating that space. I was uncommitted for 3 months, is where this idea of the financial literacy program came up, because I was uncommitted. I was on a walk, and someone I was listening to was talking about, something we really need is, financial literacy for kids in high school. And I said, well, why not? And then I started doing research. And again, the school's very small, and I had the relationships with them because of, coaching. They've been very receptive. And, so now I'm figuring out, how to make something that's relevant, for them. But again, that came because I had space, being uncommitted, and kind of putting together things that, are really important to me.
Yeah. Well, you emphasize the planning quite a bit, but I think a word you just used has probably been most impactful to your retirement, which is grateful. I think that's a
Yeah.
big help, is your attitude towards that. Yeah. Good.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And something that I don't think I've ever been great at, just because of the, type of personality that I am. But now, especially, and again, I hear stories of people getting sick, or they passed away like right after they retired, and you hear those stories. And so I feel very grateful. And also that's what drives me to not waste the time, like not just let it, make it something that's intentional, for me. And again, that's personal. People can be listening to this, this guy, he's still working, but no, I mean, it's like, but whatever works for you. I think the concept of making sure that you're not just walking into this thing, and you've had people on that think they're just going to golf every day, and think they're just going to go to the beach, or think they're going to travel. There's a period where that's not going to be what you want to do. And whatever that is, just, start thinking through what some of those other areas might be.
Yeah, definitely. Good. Well, I got one more question for you, Anthony. Before that, tell us what's the best way for someone to reach out to you?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned a couple of times I have a blog. It's called For the Napos. It came out of inspiration from two of my financial heroes. One, Fritz Gilbert, like we've talked about. He started a blog, and he's always talking about just being curious. And so I thought, well, writing is easy for me. If you do check out the blog, I'm not saying I'm a good writer, but it's easy for me to get ideas onto a page. And then the other is JL Collins, and his inspiration was, his blog was around writing for his daughter
Right.
and
Yes.
passing down lessons for her that she didn't want to hear. And so that's what For the Napos is about. So you can go to that blog, and if you want to reach out, you can reach out. If you want to sign up, you can there. There's a whole bunch of topics, but really more about things I want to pass on to my kids. But there's also stuff about traveling. If you want my mom's sauce recipe, it's on there too. There's other things on there too. And then LinkedIn. You
Yep.
can just reach out to me on LinkedIn as well.
Right on. We'll have links to For the Napos and also your LinkedIn profile, so you can go
Awesome.
there. And Anthony talked about his retirement plan that he did, which I was not connected with. But if you want to learn more about how to create your own retirement master plan, I've got a 5-step way to do that through 5stepretirementplan.com. So head on over there. All right, final question for you, Anthony. Tell us something about yourself that few people know about. And remember, this podcast is ready to clean.
Oh, thank you for that
Yeah.
part. Let's see. Few people would know. I mean, my close friends know, but I played baseball
Mm-hmm.
in college, and I spent 2 summers playing baseball in Anchorage, Alaska, over the summer in between, my sophomore and junior and senior year. And then in 2005, I was inducted into my college's Sports Hall of Fame.
Oh, way to go. Must have been a good baseball player.
Yeah, I was good for back
Yeah.
then.
There you go. did well enough. Yep. That's awesome.
Well enough. So
Yeah,
thank
that's
you.
great. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Anthony, showing us what retirement is really like. I like this idea of a true retirement story. And of course, if you want to share your own true retirement story to help the community here, reach out to me at podcast@keilfp.com. Thanks for coming on the show, Anthony.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for listening to the Retire Today podcast. We believe if you know more about your money, you will feel better about your money and you will make better money decisions. Hi, I'm Jeremy Keil. If you'd like to learn how my team can help you get more income, pay less in taxes, and avoid big retirement mistakes, head on over to keilfp.com. That's KEILFP.com.